He was just a tiny golden puppy, only 12 weeks old, when someone threw him off a 10th floor balcony like he was nothing. But what happened next, who caught him, how he survived, and how he became the heart of a healing home, will stay with you forever. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about falling, faith, and the power of second chances. And if you've ever needed a sign that God still works through love, this is it. Have you ever wondered if God still sends miracles to the world today? If you believe that God still speaks through love, faithfulness, and the things we least expect, follow this story to the end. And if your heart is touched, leave an amen in the comments below. Please hit that subscribe button so I can send you more amazing stories. Thank you so much for that. Seattle in early March wore its gray like a second skin. Thick skies bruised with cloud cover, a soft drizzle that never quite stopped, and wind that whispered through alleyways like it knew secrets. The buildings along Pine Street stood tall and glassy, their reflections dulled by weeks of endless rain. Somewhere between Capitol Hill's quiet charm and the bustling sprawl of downtown, life ticked forward in muted rhythm. On the 10th floor of an aging apartment complex, with ivy creeping stubbornly along its brick facade, Emily Monroe stood in the small kitchen of Unit 10B, staring at a chipped ceramic mug she'd painted in college. She held it like it might tell her what to do next. Emily, 27, was the kind of woman who had long since stopped believing that softness equaled weakness. She was tall and slender, with delicate features often framed by a messy bun of russet-brown curls. Freckles dotted her pale skin, especially along her nose, and her eyes, clear hazel, held a quiet wariness, like someone always scanning the horizon for storm clouds. She worked as a children's book illustrator, the kind who poured every emotion into soft watercolor scenes of adventure and friendship. Yet in real life, she had become a master at hiding bruises, not just the ones that bloomed on skin, but the ones that fractured trust. Her relationship with Jason Crowley had begun like a spark, handsome, charming, and attentive, but over the course of a year, that spark turned to smoke, and eventually suffocation. She had ended it 3 nights ago after he'd called her pathetic during an argument and punched a hole in her bookshelf, narrowly missing her head. She hadn't changed the locks yet. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she hoped he'd stay gone. Maybe some part of her still felt like it was her fault. Now, the apartment felt too quiet. The only sound came from the steady breathing of a small golden body curled beneath the window near the balcony door. Harvey, a 12-week-old golden retriever she had adopted only 6 days earlier from a shelter in West Seattle, lay wrapped in a navy fleece blanket patterned with white bones. His fur was the color of morning toast, warm and soft, with a darker streak of cinnamon along his back. His ears still flopped too much when he walked, and his paws were comically large compared to the rest of him. Harvey didn't bark, not even once since she brought him home. He didn't need to. He followed her like her shadow, watched her with wide eyes, and curled against her legs when she cried. Harvey was small, but in his presence, Emily found something she hadn't felt in months: peace. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the building's old balcony door to rattle faintly. Emily grabbed her coat. She was out of almond milk and oat crackers, the only thing she could stomach lately, and the bodega 2 blocks down was still open. "I'll be back in 10, Harvey," she whispered, running a hand over his head. He barely stirred. She didn't lock the balcony. She rarely did. 10 minutes later, the hallway outside her apartment remained still, but inside, the air shifted. The front door creaked open. Jason Crowley stepped through the threshold like a ghost slipping into a familiar haunting. He was in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered with blonde hair slicked back into cruel perfection. His eyes were a sharp, glacial blue, beautiful until they turned cold. His clothes were clean, but his presence was sour with anger. Jason moved like he owned the room, even as it betrayed him. The photos gone, his shaving kit missing, his boots no longer by the door. Instead, there were twinkle lights, a fleece blanket, and a dog. Harvey stirred under the blanket. He raised his head, ears flopping forward, nose twitching. He knew that scent. He had met it once. There was no growl, no bark, just recognition. Jason crouched and grabbed him by the scruff. Not gently, not cruelly, just with complete disregard, like removing something in his way. Harvey whimpered, legs dangling, paws twitching in confusion. Jason slid the balcony door open. The cold wind rushed in. Without pause, he stepped to the edge and let go. 6 floors below, parked near the fire lane and waiting for the next call, sat a red and white EMS truck. Inside, Kyle Brennan leaned against the hood, sipping lukewarm coffee and letting the drizzle kiss his cheeks. Kyle was 32, lean but strong, with dark blonde hair kept short and a trimmed beard that softened his angular jaw. His uniform bore the marks of long shifts, creases at the elbows, faint coffee stains, but he wore it with quiet pride. There was a scar just beneath his chin, barely noticeable unless he turned his head. He had served 3 tours overseas before coming home and retraining as an EMT. He rarely talked about it. What mattered now was helping people before they broke. Kyle's eyes had a way of narrowing when he listened, like he was focusing not just on words, but on the silence between them. He was good under pressure, some said too calm, too removed, but inside him was a fire carefully contained. In the passenger seat of the truck, his 9-year-old nephew Mason sat with a graphic novel half open in his lap. Mason had lived with Kyle since his mother, Kyle's sister, had passed away 18 months earlier from a sudden aneurysm. The boy was small for his age, pale with light brown curls and oversized eyes that didn't blink as often as they should. He spoke rarely, and never when there were dogs nearby. He'd been bitten once when he was 5, and the fear never left. Kyle looked up just in time to see something fall from above. At first, he thought it was trash. A scarf, maybe. But it moved, twitched. His EMT brain reacted faster than thought. He dropped the coffee, sprinted forward, arms out. The weight landed in his chest like a sack of warm flour, knocking the wind from his lungs. He stumbled back, caught his balance. Looked down. A puppy. Golden. Shaking. Bleeding. Harvey. Kyle didn't speak. He simply turned and sprinted back toward the truck, yelling over his shoulder, "Mason, stay inside." His heart thundered louder than the sirens. The rain had thickened into a steady curtain as Kyle steered the EMS rig through the slick streets of Seattle, the tires hissing over glistening asphalt like a whisper in a nightmare. The city glowed through the downpour, reflected neon signs, amber streetlights, the cold shimmer of traffic signals stretched across puddles. In the back of the vehicle, wrapped in a thermal rescue blanket and cradled in Kyle's arms, the small golden form of Harvey trembled softly. His breath came in shallow bursts, barely rising his chest, and blood had begun to dry at the edges of a small gash above his brow. One of his hind legs hung at an unnatural angle beneath the fabric, and his tiny ribs seemed too delicate for the weight of survival. But he was alive. Kyle Brennan, a man trained to remain steady in chaos, felt something cracking beneath the weight of the pup in his arms. He had carried wounded soldiers, cradled broken bodies in war zones, and held too many strangers during their final breaths. But this helpless, silent life that had dropped from the sky, felt different. It wasn't just the fall. It was the fact that someone had let go. The destination ahead was a 1-story brick building tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a Vietnamese bakery on the quieter edge of Madison Street. A faded wooden sign above the door read Castillo Veterinary Care, the paint worn smooth by weather and time. Kyle parked and rushed inside without knocking. Dr. Nora Castillo looked up from her paperwork behind the front desk and froze. She had always been composed, practical, deliberate, and capable, but the sight of Kyle, soaked to the bone, carrying a broken puppy wrapped in a rescue blanket, disrupted her rhythm. Nora was in her early 30s, with dark brown skin and thick, tightly curled hair pulled into a no-nonsense puff above her head. She wore gray scrubs under a navy zip-up, and her black-framed glasses perched low on the bridge of her nose. Her movements, like her speech, were calm and economical. But her eyes, rich with amber flecks, missed nothing. Years ago, she and Kyle had shared something more than camaraderie during their last overseas deployment. Long evenings under unforgiving skies, moments stolen between duties, a friendship that flirted with permanence until war and distance tore it at the seams. They had parted without anger, but with the quiet heaviness of timing gone wrong. Now, without needing an explanation, she gestured toward the treatment room. Come. Put him on the table. Kyle laid Harvey down as gently as possible onto the padded surface. Nora pulled on gloves, her demeanor shifting to full professional focus. She moved with practiced hands, examining the pup with steady fingers, checking breath, reflexes, circulation. Her assistant, a young man named Ravi, emerged from the back carrying supplies. Ravi was tall, thin, and perpetually sleep-deprived, with shaggy brown hair and the quiet patience of someone who preferred animals to people. He didn't speak unless necessary, and now he only nodded once to Kyle before moving to prepare the four. Femur fracture, laceration to the head, possibly some internal bruising, Nora murmured, mostly to herself. No flail chest. No spinal response delay. That's lucky. Someone dropped him, Kyle said, his voice like gravel. From a building. Maybe 10 stories. He didn't slip, he was thrown. Nora's hands paused for a moment. She looked up. You sure? He didn't flail, Kyle said, jaw clenched. No signs of panic. It was fast. Deliberate. Her face darkened, but she only said, he's alive. Barely. Let's stabilize him. As she inserted the catheter and monitored vitals, Kyle stood silently in the corner, arms folded tight across his chest. His shirt clung to him, soaked from the rain, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes never left the table. After 20 minutes, Ravi stepped back and gave a nod. Nora checked one last set of numbers, then finally peeled off her gloves. He's stable. But it's a wait and see now. Kyle nodded slowly. Then looking down at the pup again, he said, more to himself than anyone else, Sunbeam. Nora raised an eyebrow. What? That's what I'm calling him, Kyle replied. He fell like a shaft of light. And I'm not sure how, but I think he was supposed to land in my arms. For a moment, Nora allowed herself to smile. Dramatic, even for you, Brennan. I think he earned it, Kyle muttered. Back at the apartment on the edge of Green Lake, Mason Brennan sat curled in the corner of the living room sofa, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped tight. The boy had not spoken a word since Kyle had left with the ambulance. His book lay face down on the floor, forgotten. His room, just 10 steps down the hall, felt too far. The shadows in the apartment had lengthened, and the distant sound of thunder rolled low and sleepy across the horizon. He had caught a glimpse of the puppy, golden and bleeding, and something inside him had twisted. Fear. Memory. A flash of teeth from years ago, the panic of being bitten, the screams that followed. Since then, Mason avoided animals like they were loaded weapons. He waited for Kyle to return, but didn't go near the window. He didn't need to know. He didn't want to. Hours later, when Kyle finally stepped back inside, his boots leaving wet prints across the floor, Mason looked up with wide eyes but said nothing. Kyle removed his soaked jacket and crouched beside the sofa. He's okay, he said gently. Barely. But he's a fighter. Mason didn't answer. But he didn't look away either. Kyle ruffled the boy's curls and said no more. By morning, Seattle had traded rain for fog, a thick, silver haze that muffled every sound and softened the sharp edges of the waking city. Rooftops vanished beneath the mist, and the waters of Lake Union seemed to hold their breath. Emily Monroe stood at the corner of Broadway and Pine, her scarf damp against her chin, her eyes scanning the street through bleary exhaustion. She hadn't slept. Not really. Not since she returned from the corner store last night and found her apartment eerily silent. The blanket near the balcony door was rumpled. Harvey's water bowl was half full. But the puppy, the soft, golden heartbeat she had only just started to rely on, was gone. At first, she searched the entire apartment, calling his name like it might pull him from thin air. Then panic set in. She checked under the bed, inside closets, even the bathroom cabinet. Nothing. The balcony door had been ajar. Her mind went to dark places. She thought of accidents. Then she thought of Jason. That was when her stomach twisted and she nearly vomited. She remembered the way he had stared at Harvey when they last spoke, cold, calculating. Replaced me with a mutt, he'd muttered. She had laughed then, but now the laughter felt like a warning she ignored. By dawn, she had called every local shelter, posted on neighborhood forums, sent messages to dog rescue groups. Her fingers trembled as she typed, but she kept going. She uploaded a photo. Harvey curled on a blue blanket, eyes wide, ears flopped over like half-drawn curtains. She wrote, "Lost puppy 12 weeks old golden retriever responds T.O. Harvey missing since last night reward." She hit post and prayed someone had seen him. It was around 10 a.m. when her phone buzzed with a notification from a local Reddit thread titled, "Unbelievable Seattle Moment EMT Catches Falling Dog." She clicked on it absently, expecting nothing, but as the video played, her blood ran cold. A shaky camera phone captured a blur of gold dropping from above. A man in uniform dove forward, arms open. There was a shout. Then the camera zoomed in on the man cradling a small dog against his chest. Even through pixelation and bad lighting, Emily recognized the cinnamon swirl on that golden fur. Her legs buckled. She sank to the floor of her kitchen, phone clutched in both hands. "Harvey," she whispered. The video was tagged with a location, Castillo Veterinary Care, Madison Street. She threw on her coat and was out the door in less than 3 minutes. Across town, Nora Castillo stood in the front room of her clinic, gently swaying as she rocked a heating pad in her arms. Harvey, now wrapped in layers of gauze, blankets, and warmth, lay curled in her embrace. The night had been long, filled with quiet beeping machines, slow 4 drips, and tension that settled in the bones. But he was still breathing, and his vitals were holding. In the soft morning light, he looked less like a miracle and more like a child who had barely escaped something unspeakable. Kyle had stayed most of the night, sleeping upright in a chair in the corner. He stirred as the clinic's doorbell chimed, his eyes immediately alert. The woman who entered looked like she'd run the length of the city to get there. She was tall, slight, with dark circles under pale green eyes. Her auburn hair was pulled into a haphazard ponytail, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her coat was half-zipped, scarf trailing like a forgotten ribbon. I saw the video," she said, voice frayed and breathless. "The dog. That's my dog." Nora took one look at the woman's trembling hands, the bruised tension in her posture, and nodded. "You're Emily?" "Yes." Without hesitation, Nora led her through the swinging doors. Harvey lay on a raised table, his breathing slow but steady, one leg splinted, his brow still bandaged. At the sound of her voice, just the whisper of "Hey, baby," his ears twitched. He tried to lift his head, but the weight of pain anchored him. His tail stirred once beneath the blanket. Emily choked on a sob and dropped to her knees beside the table, reaching out with shaking fingers. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. Harvey gave a weak huff, then leaned his nose into her palm. Kyle, still seated in the corner, watched the reunion unfold. There was something about the way she touched the dog, like she needed his existence to breathe. Nora stepped back, watching quietly. As a veterinarian, she had seen many such reunions. But this one felt layered with something else. Pain, relief, and fear that hadn't yet left. "He's lucky," she said softly. "He should have died from that height. But someone caught him." Emily looked up at Kyle for the first time. Their eyes met. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked. "You saved him." Kyle stood, awkward for a moment, then stepped forward. "He saved himself," he said. "I was just in the right place." "I'm not sure I was," Emily said faintly. Nora, sensing the weight in those words, tilted her head. "You want to sit?" Emily nodded, and Kyle helped her into a chair. For the next 20 minutes, they sat together in the quiet hum of the clinic. Nora asked a few gentle questions. When Emily had last seen Harvey, how long she'd had him, whether she had any idea what happened. Emily hesitated before answering. Then she confessed, about Jason, about the fight, about leaving him but never changing the locks. Nora said nothing at first, but her expression shifted, soft, knowing. "You're not the first woman to sit in that chair with bruises no one can see." Emily's lips trembled. "I thought maybe I was exaggerating it, that maybe I was being dramatic." "You weren't," Nora said simply. Kyle glanced between them, but remained silent. When Emily finally reached down to stroke Harvey's head again, she looked at Kyle. Is he going to be okay? He's tough, Kyle said. I think he's going to surprise us. A small, fragile smile ghosted across Emily's face. He's always been like that. Quiet, watchful, but stronger than he looks. Like someone else I know, Nora murmured, earning a brief look from Kyle. In the lobby, Robbie glanced through the glass and saw a woman in her early 40s pacing nervously outside. She was tall, sharply dressed, with long blonde hair and a clipboard in hand. Her name was Lauren Farley, a volunteer with a local animal rescue network who had come to drop off flyers. She knocked once, then peeked in, curious. Nora excused herself to greet her, leaving Kyle and Emily alone with the still sleeping puppy. There was silence for a while, not awkward, but heavy with all the things neither of them had the words for. Then Kyle said, "We're going to keep him for observation just a little longer." "But he's fighting. That's what matters." Emily nodded. "That's what he's always done." Kyle glanced down at Harvey, then back at her. "And what about you?" Emily met his eyes again. "I think I'm just starting to learn how." The air was colder that afternoon, the sky in Seattle shifting from fog to that pale, dry gray that meant the clouds had tired themselves out but hadn't yet moved on. The sun made no promises, but light began to creep between buildings like an apology. Inside Castillo Veterinary Care, the warmth was almost jarring in contrast. Heat lamps glowed over padded recovery beds, and the scent of antiseptic mingled gently with chamomile diffused from a corner humidifier. Harvey lay curled in a soft donut-shaped cushion lined with fleece. His bandaged leg was splinted, his head still wrapped in gauze, but his breathing had deepened. The tremors had stopped. He was sleeping soundly, his tail twitching now and then as if dreaming. Emily Monroe sat nearby, her elbows resting on her knees, fingers knitted under her chin. She wore a worn green cardigan over a floral top, her jeans faded and scuffed at the hems. Her auburn hair had been pulled back into a low bun, but loose strands framed her face, casting shadows along her pale jaw. Her eyes, rimmed with sleepless circles, flicked between Harvey and the floor. There was something soft about her posture, but also something taut, like a violin string strung too tightly for too long. Kyle Brennan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, watching the quiet scene unfold. His EMT uniform had been traded for a navy pullover and jeans, but the rigid readiness hadn't left him. It had been hours since the reunion. Harvey's condition was stable, but he wasn't going home yet. Emily had agreed to wait, but her mind was a carousel of dread. She hadn't told anyone about Jason. Not really. Not fully. She'd hinted to friends that he was controlling, or kind of intense, but always followed with a shrug and a joke. That was easier than admitting she was afraid. Now, watching Harvey sleep, the weight of that fear pressed into her lungs. Nora Castillo entered the room carrying a tablet and 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Emily and sat down beside her. Nora's hair had been tied into a thick braid down her back, and her glasses had slid slightly down her nose. Despite her calm appearance, her gaze was sharp. "Chamomile," she said, "no caffeine. You look like you've been in a fight with a freight train." Emily took the mug with a thin smile. "I feel like I lost." Nora didn't respond right away. She looked over at Harvey. "He's healing," she said. "You helped him do that by getting here when you did." "I didn't get here fast enough," Emily whispered. "Fast enough is relative," Nora said. "You're here now." Silence grew between them, warm and uncomfortable. Then softly Nora asked, "You said someone might have done this? On purpose?" Emily froze, then nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You want to tell me about him?" Emily stared at the mug in her hands. "His name's Jason. We met 2 years ago. He was charming, smart. He knew what to say to make me feel seen. At first, it felt like we were magic together. Then little things changed. He didn't like my friends. Didn't want me staying late at the studio. Told me my illustrations were too childish. He never hit me. Just made sure I knew I wasn't good enough. After a while, I believed him." Her voice cracked. "I thought I was lucky he stayed." Nora set the tablet down. "A lot of people stay because leaving feels like failure. Emily wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. I left last week. Told him it was over. He didn't yell. Just smiled and said I'd come crawling back. I didn't change the locks. Part of me didn't think he'd actually do anything, and part of me didn't want to admit I needed protecting. Kyle stepped forward finally. You do? Emily looked up, surprised. If he comes near you again, Kyle said, his voice steady, I'll be there. I don't care what kind of threats he makes or how convincing he seems. You're not alone in this. She stared at him, eyes wide, something unreadable flickering there. Gratitude, maybe. Or disbelief. Nora added gently, we could help you file a report. Just so it's on record. That way, if anything happens. I'm scared, Emily said, so quietly it was almost a breath. Nora nodded. That means you're aware. That's strength, not weakness. At that moment, a bird landed just outside the window, a tiny sparrow hopping along the sill with no urgency. From the hallway, Mason Brennan peeked through the doorway, clutching a sketchpad to his chest. The 9-year-old's hair was messy, his clothes mismatched, a red t-shirt under a zip-up hoodie decorated with dinosaur teeth. He didn't speak. He rarely did. But something had pulled him out of his room. He looked toward Harvey, then at the bird. Then back. Harvey stirred at the window light and shifted his paw. The bird hopped closer, chirped once, then fluttered off. Mason didn't flinch. That was new. Emily turned, noticing the boy for the first time. Hi there, she said softly. Are you Mason? He nodded once. This is Harvey, she said. He's very gentle. Mason looked at the dog, then scribbled something quickly on the notepad. He held it up. Is he scared like me? Emily's heart clenched. She nodded. I think he was. But he's starting to feel safe again. Nora crouched beside Mason. You know, animals can help us heal too. Sometimes they understand things we don't even say. Mason's eyes didn't leave Harvey. Nora continued. There's a therapy approach where kids like you spend time with animals who've also been through something hard. You help each other get better. Mason scribbled again. Can I sit with him? Of course, Nora said. He stepped in slowly, inching closer to the recovery bed. Harvey, sensing someone nearby, opened one eye, then closed it again. His tail thumped once, lightly. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor and pulled his sketchpad into his lap. He didn't speak, but he didn't run either. The early evening haze had settled low over Seattle like a blanket soaked in dusk, filtering the last light into amber streaks through the clinic windows. Castillo Veterinary Care was quiet, lit by soft overhead lights and the steady pulse of machinery that kept small creatures tethered to life. Harvey was lying in his usual spot on the recovery bed, half asleep, ears twitching at faint sounds from the hallway. His breathing had steadied in recent days, and the bruises under his golden fur were beginning to fade, though his splinted legs still made movement difficult. He had begun responding more to voices, to scent, to the gentle touch of a hand. Especially Mason's. Kyle stood in the reception area, flipping through a patient report on Nora's desk. The fireman-turned-MT was growing used to the scent of antiseptic and chamomile that seemed permanently soaked into the air here. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing faint burn scars along his forearms from a warehouse fire years ago. He carried them without explanation. He had once told Nora that some things didn't need retelling. They lived in the body whether you spoke them or not. Now, with one foot unconsciously tapping against the floor, Kyle looked toward the glass front door, uneasy. Emily had returned an hour ago to check in on Harvey and bring fresh supplies. Her sketchbook, a fleece blanket from her apartment that still smelled faintly of lemon detergent, and her perfume. She was calmer now, a bit less hollowed out, her movements no longer flinching at every sound. But the tension lingered in her shoulders, just beneath the surface. Her auburn hair had been brushed, and she wore a denim jacket with sleeves too long for her arms, as if she were still trying to disappear into it. Mason was in the corner reading beside Harvey's bed, his sketchpad beside him, and a marker uncapped in his hand. Harvey's tail moved now, and then with each quiet breath from the boy. Then the door opened. It wasn't rushed, wasn't loud. But something about the movement made Kyle look up instantly. Jason Crowley walked into the clinic like he owned the light. He was wearing a black coat with sharp lapels, his blonde hair slicked back into a precise wave. He looked every bit like the charming boyfriend he used to pretend to be, clean-shaven, well-dressed, calculated. But his eyes betrayed the truth. They were wide, glassy, and too sharp to belong to a man in control. Emily froze mid-step. The air seemed to pause. Jason's voice was smooth. "So this is where you've been hiding." Kyle stepped forward before anyone else could move. "You need to leave." Jason tilted his head, mock innocence playing across his face. "I'm here to see my dog." "You don't have a dog," Kyle said, arms tense, eyes unreadable. "That's funny," Jason said, smirking. "Last I checked, I lived in that apartment. I bought the food. I named him." He turned to Emily, who was pale now, jaw tight. "Did you tell them I abused the dog too? Or just that I was a monster to you?" Emily tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Jason's tone sharpened. "You always did like playing the victim. Worked for you before." Behind them, Harvey let out a low whimper. Barely a sound, but it was sharp, reactive. He began to pant, shifting his head left and right, eyes wide. His back legs twitched beneath the blanket. Mason looked at the dog, then at the man's voice. The boy's face blanched, his mouth opened slightly, eyes darting toward Emily. Then something shifted. Harvey began to tremble, not from pain, but fear. His breathing quickened, his tail went still, and the moment cracked open like glass. Mason, normally frozen in such moments, moved. Without thinking, he slid off his chair, dropped the marker, and crawled toward Harvey. The boy wrapped his small arms around the dog's neck, pressing his cheek to the golden fur. "Shoo," he whispered over and over, voice trembling. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm here." Everyone saw it. The moment Harvey stopped shaking, the way his breathing slowed under the boy's touch. The sound of trust settling into the space between them. Kyle's eyes glinted. Nora, who had just entered the room from the back, paused with a clipboard in her hand and watched silently. Jason noticed too, but he misread the moment. "Oh, what is this now?" he sneered. "You've turned the dog into some kind of therapy tool? For your broken little family project?" Kyle stepped closer. "You need to leave. Now." Jason squared his shoulders. "You have no legal right to keep her or the dog from me." "We'll see what the police say about that," Kyle said calmly. "There's no report," Jason snapped. "No record. Nothing to prove anything." He turned on his heel, walking toward the door, then spun back and pointed at Emily. "This isn't over. You hear me? You think you're safe because some wannabe hero caught a falling mutt?" His eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." He left. The door slammed so hard the walls shook. For a long moment, no one spoke. Emily stood frozen, her fists clenched, jaw set. Nora walked to her and placed a hand lightly on her arm. "We'll make the report now," she said softly. "I'll help you." Emily nodded, eyes glassy but full of something solid now. "I'm ready." Kyle looked at Mason, still holding Harvey. "You okay, buddy?" Mason nodded. Then, very softly, he said, he was scared too. Kyle knelt beside him. "Yeah," he said. "But you helped him." Mason looked at his uncle. "He helped me first." Rain returned to Seattle like a memory, soft and persistent, streaking down the tall windows of Kyle Brennan's apartment with gentle rhythm. The sky was a pale sheet of gray, pressed low over rooftops, and the scent of damp earth seeped through cracks in windowsills. From the living room window, you could barely see across the street. The world was wrapped in mist and muffled sound. But inside the apartment, something quieter was growing, peace, tentative and new, like a seed pushing up through cold soil. Emily Monroe stood at the kitchen counter, barefoot, wrapped in a thick cardigan over a cotton dress dotted with watercolor flowers. Her auburn hair was tied up in a loose bun, a pencil tucked behind one ear, and she was holding a chipped ceramic mug in both hands, letting the warmth ground her. Her eyes, still carrying shadows, had begun to lose the hunted look they once held. It had been 4 days since Jason's outburst at the clinic, and 3 since she accepted Kyle's offer to stay in the spare room. Just until things calmed down, he'd said. But no one was counting the days. The apartment was modest, second floor, with dark hardwood floors and furniture that spoke more of function than style. Framed photos lined the mantel. A young Kyle in uniform beside another man who looked just like him, his twin brother Ryan, lost in a building collapse during a call years ago. A small bookshelf held well-worn novels and firefighting manuals. In the center of the living room, Harvey lay stretched out on a thick dog bed, his golden fur brushed and soft, his bandaged legs sticking out like a crooked paddle. His eyes followed Emily with quiet loyalty, tail thumping softly when she moved. Kyle entered from the hallway wearing an old fire department t-shirt and jeans, a towel over one shoulder, and damp curls pushed back from his forehead. "Coffee's fresh," he said, moving toward the kettle. "You sleep okay?" Emily nodded. "Better than I thought I would. You hungry?" "I made toast." "Living dangerously," he joked, and she smiled, a real one, not the kind she used to hide behind. In the other room, Mason sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by papers and markers, a small portable lamp casting golden light over his workspace. He was 9, small for his age, with a serious expression and a brow that furrowed when he was concentrating. His light brown curls were uncombed, and his green hoodie was speckled with paint. In front of him lay a stack of handwritten stories stapled together at the corners. They had titles like The Dog That Flew and Bravery in the Rain. Emily stepped into the doorway. "You working on something new?" Mason looked up, startled, then nodded. He reached for a folder and opened it, revealing a short story about a dog named Blaze who saved a lost girl in the woods. The drawing beside it showed a golden retriever, big ears and all, with a red scarf fluttering behind him. "You wrote this?" she asked gently. He nodded again. "May I?" He handed it over, eyes dropping to his knees. She read silently, lips parting with emotion. "This is beautiful," she said. "Do you want help with illustrations?" He looked up, uncertain. "I used to draw books like this for a living," she offered. He tilted his head. "Real ones?" She nodded. "Real ones." Harvey, hearing their voices, pushed himself upright on his good legs and limped across the floor to rest beside Mason. The boy immediately reached for him, stroking the dog's neck with instinctive tenderness. Emily crouched beside them. "Maybe we can make a book together. You write, I draw, and Harvey gets to be the hero." Mason smiled, small, shy, but bright as dawn. In the kitchen, Kyle listened from behind the doorframe, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt. Later that afternoon, Nora Castillo sat in her office at the back of the clinic, her glasses resting low on her nose as she typed into her laptop. The room was lined with veterinary charts and photos of adopted animals on cork boards. She looked tired, her braid loose and a coffee cup half drained at her elbow. On her screen was a document labeled Suspected Domestic Abuse Monroe, Emily. She hesitated only once before clicking Submit. The report went to Seattle PD's Domestic Violence Unit. No embellishment, just facts. A history of verbal threats, suspected forced entry, signs of psychological manipulation, and endangerment of an animal. It wasn't a full case, but it was something. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and muttered to herself, "Sometimes you start the fire by striking the match." By evening, the rain slowed into drizzle, and the apartment glowed with warm lamplight. Emily sat at the kitchen table sketching a scene of Blaze the dog, pulling a sled through snow. Mason sat across from her, adding notes in the margins of the manuscript. Kyle cooked dinner, occasionally glancing over his shoulder to watch them. The smell of grilled cheese and tomato soup filled the space. "Hey, Em," Kyle said, voice casual. "I saw a flyer today for a community art show in Ballard. They're looking for kid and parent duos to submit something." She looked up. "Parent and kid?" "Well," he said, glancing at Mason, "not every family looks the same." Mason didn't look up. "I think we could win." Harvey barked softly. Emily smiled. Maybe they could. The rain had stopped overnight, but the streets of Seattle remained slick with leftover fear. Early spring light filtered through the clouds like pale glass, casting long shadows across the sidewalks outside Station 12, the modest, red-bricked EMT outpost where Kyle Brennan worked his shifts. The station wasn't large, just a converted warehouse with a couple of rigs, lockers, and a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and grease from decades past. But today it felt different. Heavy. Charged. Emily Monroe stood in the station kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that Kyle had sworn he would replace for months. She was dressed in dark jeans and a soft cream sweater, her auburn hair tied back in a ponytail. There was something sharper about her now. Not hard, but sure. Her bruises, both visible and hidden, had begun to fade, and in their place was something like steel wrapped in silk. She glanced out the window toward the alley, then back to the door, where Harvey lay curled in his dog bed, splinted leg tucked underneath his chest, one eye watching the world. He had gained back his weight, his coat was brushed to a golden sheen, and though he still limped, he held himself like he knew he was needed. Mason sat on the floor near the dog, hunched over a sketchbook, drawing intently. His green hoodie was 2 sizes too big and covered in marker stains, and his brow furrowed in concentration. Every so often, he reached out to scratch Harvey's ear or lean close to whisper something that only the dog seemed to understand. Kyle stood near the truck bay, sipping coffee, eyes flicking toward the entrance like a man waiting for a storm. He was wearing his duty uniform, navy shirt, radio clipped at the collar, sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was a stiffness in his stance that hadn't been there in days. When Nora's report had been submitted to the police, Kyle thought the system might finally work. But Jason Crowley had vanished. No one had seen him. No arrest had been made. The silence, more than anything, set Kyle's nerves on edge. He was about to speak when the back door crashed open. Jason burst into the room with the jagged chaos of a man who had nothing left to lose. His coat was soaked from the alleyway rain, hair matted against his forehead, eyes wild. He looked thinner, angrier, like the days had eaten away his restraint. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the walls. Emily turned, pale but steady. "You need to leave." "No," Jason snarled, stepping forward. "You think you can just erase me? Move in with him? Pretend I never existed?" Kyle stepped between them, voice low and hard. "Back away." Jason didn't. "You think this changes anything? You think a dog and a new boyfriend and playing house makes you safe?" He lunged. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Kyle moved first, intercepting Jason's charge with a force that sent both men tumbling against a metal cabinet. Tools clattered to the floor. Jason swung wildly, fists flailing, but Kyle was trained, controlled. He twisted Jason's arm behind his back and forced him down, pressing a knee into his spine. In the chaos, Harvey rose from his bed. He saw Emily stumble back, Jason's hand brushing her leg as he tried to grab at her while pinned. The golden retriever growled, a deep, low sound that hadn't left his throat since the fall. Then he limped forward, still partially lame, and sank his teeth into Jason's calf. Jason screamed. Harvey released and backed away, standing between Emily and danger, chest heaving, ears flat. Emily knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, whispering his name like a prayer. Mason had dropped his sketchbook, eyes wide, frozen, but only for a moment. Then he ran to Emily and Harvey, knelt beside them, and threw his arms around them both. "I'm not scared," he whispered. "Not anymore." Sirens wailed in the distance. Kyle stood over Jason, who had gone still, eyes wide with pain and rage, and the realization that this time he had lost. 2 uniformed officers entered through the front in seconds. One male, mid-40s with close-cropped blonde hair, the other female, sharp-eyed with a notepad already in hand. "Hands where we can see them," the female officer barked. Kyle raised his hands and stepped back. He broke in, threatened her, tried to drag her out. Jason tried to speak, but one of the officers shut him down quickly, reading him his rights as they pulled him upright. Blood stained his pant leg where Harvey had bitten, but it was his silence, his stunned disbelief, that echoed loudest. The officers nodded at Kyle. "We've got Nora Castillo's report, and video from the station camera. This won't be hard." Emily watched as they led Jason out the door. He didn't look back. The silence left in his wake felt different this time. Later that evening, as the sun began to set in streaks of pale orange over the city skyline, the apartment was quiet again. Mason sat beside Harvey, now bandaged and sleeping, drawing a new cover for their storybook. Emily was at the table, adding watercolor to the sky behind the heroic dog. Kyle stood near the window, watching the street below, hand resting gently on the sill. Emily glanced at Mason, then at Kyle. "He asked me," she said. Kyle turned. "Who?" "Mason. If we could all stay like this. Together." Kyle hesitated. "What did you say?" She smiled, eyes shining. "I said yes." The morning sun broke gently over the Seattle skyline, casting golden streaks across the wide windows of a renovated craftsman building tucked along the edge of Green Lake. It had once been an abandoned community center, its walls scarred by graffiti and time. Now, repainted in soft teal and ivory, it stood proudly behind a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Harvey's Haven, a place to heal." The front garden had been landscaped with native flowers, and a short white fence surrounded the yard where several dogs now played. There was laughter inside. The good kind. The real kind. Emily Monroe stood near the front window, adjusting a stack of flyers on the welcome table. Her hair had grown a little longer, tied back in a loose braid, and though she still wore paint-smeared jeans, there was a new lightness to her gait, like her shoulders no longer remembered what it was to flinch. She wore a soft green shirt under a denim apron with paw prints on the front, and a small pin on the chest read Director Harvey's Haven. The pin had been Kyle's idea. At her feet, Harvey trotted past, a year older now, stronger. His golden coat had filled out into a thick, lustrous sheen, and though he still carried a faint limp on his back leg, it no longer hindered him. He wore a custom blue harness embroidered with the word Therapy Dog, and as he moved through the space, heads turned and smiles followed. Children reached for him, and Harvey leaned into their hands with quiet grace, his eyes patient, his movements slow. He had become a guardian in fur, a keeper of stories and pain too big for young mouths to speak. Mason sat at a corner table near the reading area, surrounded by a stack of books and one very important copy on display. The title gleamed on the cover in bold, childlike font, Harvey the Sky Dog. He wore a dark vest over a white shirt, his curls neatly combed, though his sneakers were still scuffed. He was taller now, more confident, and though he still rarely spoke in crowds, his eyes no longer darted with fear. They looked forward, steady and bright. Kyle Brennan adjusted the microphone at the front of the room, clearing his throat before speaking to the modest crowd that had gathered for the opening ceremony. Dressed in a button-down shirt and rolled sleeves, his familiar EMT boots still peeked out from beneath his slacks. His jaw was as strong as ever, his presence grounded and unshakable. He hadn't intended to become a co-founder of a healing center, but when Emily brought it up a year ago, after everything had settled, he hadn't hesitated. "If we've got space," he said, "let's use it for good." Now, as he spoke, his voice carried across the room like a steady tide. 1 year ago, a scared dog fell from a 10-story balcony. 1 year ago, a boy who couldn't speak to animals sat still for one. 1 year ago, a woman walked through fire and found her way to safety, to trust, to family. And now, today, Harvey's Haven opens its doors, not just to rescue dogs, but to children with silent stories, to veterans carrying invisible wounds, and to anyone who needs a soft landing. Because healing doesn't always look like hospitals. Sometimes it looks like fur and crayons and small voices learning to say, "I'm okay." The audience applauded softly, some wiping tears. At the back of the room stood Nora Castillo, clipboard in hand, dressed in a navy trench and black boots, her glasses reflecting the morning light. She had helped set up the veterinary wing of Harvey's Haven, offering low-cost checkups and emergency care for rescue animals. Though she said little during the planning stages, her presence today said everything. She was proud, and maybe a little surprised to feel so much hope in a place built from so much ruin. The real moment came when Mason took the stage. He stepped up slowly, one hand clutching the podium, the other holding his book. The room hushed. A microphone had been adjusted just for his height. Emily stood to the side, watching with silent support, and Kyle knelt by Harvey, keeping the dog calm and steady. Mason opened the book and cleared his throat. The voice that came out was soft, but sure. "This is a story about falling and being caught. about a dog who flew, and a boy who learned how. It's called Harvey the Sky Dog, and it's based on something real. He turned to the final page and read aloud. When I fell, someone caught me, and now I will do that for others. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. There was a pause, then applause. Long, heartfelt, unrestrained. Afterward, children lined up with their parents to meet Harvey, to receive signed copies of the book, and to play in the indoor Courage Room, a space filled with beanbags, therapy toys, art supplies, and a quiet zone where music and dog interaction therapy were offered. In the corner of the courtyard, a woman with silver-streaked braids and warm brown eyes introduced herself to Emily. Her name was Marcy. Mid-50s, school counselor, she had brought 2 of her students that day. This, she said, gesturing at the center, is what the world's been needing. Not just another shelter, but a place where healing and stories live together. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. We've all got stories, she said. Harvey just helped us tell ours. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned, the sun now fully visible behind the clouds, painting the city in warm gold. Kyle found Emily seated on the front steps, shoes kicked off, watching Mason and Harvey play tug-of-war with a toy rope. The boy laughed freely, chasing Harvey's tail, and the dog barked with the deep, happy sounds of a creature who had once known pain but now understood joy. Kyle sat beside her. You did this, he said. Emily looked at him, then at the center. No, we did. He reached over and took her hand, fingers threading easily with hers. Mason ran over, flushed with joy. Can we stay out here a little longer? Kyle nodded. You can stay out as long as you want. Harvey flopped down beside them, head resting on Mason's knee, eyes half-lidded with contentment. And for a while, no one said anything. Because there was nothing left to fix. Only something to live. Sometimes life pushes us off ledges we never chose, into fear, into pain, into places where we forget how to hope. But even in freefall, even in the darkest moments, God sends something, or someone, to catch us. For Emily, it was a wounded dog with a silent soul. For Kyle, it was a broken boy learning to trust again. For Mason, it was a family he never expected. And for Harvey, it was love, unconditional, redemptive, and healing. This story isn't just about survival. It's about restoration, about how God takes shattered pieces, abuse, fear, abandonment, and weaves them into something beautiful. A second home, a chosen family, a mission of healing. Harvey didn't fall by accident. He fell into purpose, and through him others rose. In everyday life, we're surrounded by small miracles, acts of kindness, second chances, unexpected courage. Don't overlook them. Maybe you're someone's soft landing. Maybe your story is just beginning. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that light can rise from any fall. Comment below and tell us what part moved you the most. And if you believe in second chances, in quiet miracles, in God's perfect timing, comment Amen to stand in faith with us. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and healing. And may the Lord bless you and your loved ones, guide your steps through every storm, and remind you that no fall is too great for His grace to catch.